Hello and welcome to Sound Bites. My name is Addison Turner, and today we're going to be diving into what is, in my opinion, an extremely under-discussed part of history, the abuse and mistreatment of Chinese immigrants, primarily to North America. And folks, I fear I may have bit off a bit more than I can chew this time, pun not intended, of course. In fact, I really wasn't even aware of how profoundly this history has affected not just the people in the specific time periods, but generations of immigrants prior to being introduced to The Downstairs Girl by Chinese American author Stacey in my young adult literature course. Shout out to Dr. Fox. Today, we're going to be traveling through an extremely incomplete but roughly chronological history of Chinese immigrants from the 10th century all the way to the mid-1990s. For ease and convenience, I've gone ahead and broken this up into 3 sections. The first is going to contain a history lesson. The second will contain pertinence to legal documents. And the third is going to be why, in contemporary times, this sort of history still matters. So, let's take a look at Part 1 together. Part 1, History Lesson. Okay, first it is really important to realize that the Spanish held destination colonies far before the U.S. mistreatment of Chinese immigrants became kind of a social and cultural thing. In fact, Chinese immigration to the Philippines began in the 10th century, but the first officially documented Spanish colony and the first original official documentation of Chinese immigrants in general happened in Manila in 1571. Now, Manila is in the Philippines, but is a distinctly Spanish colony. And a lot happened in Manila in terms of intercultural violence, in terms of a lot of racism, and it kind of started to set a tone and a precedence for the rest of the world's way of looking at Chinese immigrants. In the years 1603, 1639, and 1662, there were massacres of over 50,000 immigrants in different Spanish colonies. This is the origin point of the discrimination and racial stereotyping. From author Tom Sykes, quote, "Under the Spanish colonial gaze, the Chinese were variously but often concurrently homosexual, disease-carrying, unhygienic, untrustworthy, seditious, parochial, irreligious, and economically successful enough to destabilize the status quo." That comes from paragraph 3 of his work. We will have a complete work cited in the description of this video. Now, this initial thought and this initial framing of Chinese immigrants actually will end up being echoed in a lot of Western works later. Chinese people begin to become seen as money-hungry, dirty, and greedy, fundamentally. The Philippine-American War actually also set this back, as it kind of emphasized the view of Chinese immigrants as the other, as the enemy, as people who were here to take resources away from quote-unquote Americans, right? During the 1850s, we see the first massive and the main thing that a lot of people know about Chinese immigration history, which is the California Gold Rush Chinese migration movement. So a lot of Chinese immigrants were moving en masse to San Francisco from 1839 to 1842, as a lot of unskilled manual laborers, both Chinese and Irish, were needed to construct railways during the California Gold Rush to get trains further and further into the country. Now, again, this is where a lot of people have their first formal introduction to the history of Chinese immigrants, and usually it is also their last introduction, which truthfully is really sad because there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than anybody really talks about in a history class. And again, I never got this kind of formal education on any of these events, and I never really understood how deeply the hatred and prejudice and stereotyping racially went for Chinese immigrants and a lot of people that I've known throughout my life until I began doing the research for this project. Moving into legal documents. So, a big part of why Chinese immigrants were so prejudiced against and were so kind of kept and confined to certain communities within North America, were confined to certain social structures, is because of the separation of the men in a lot of families and the forcing of men to immigrate to, whatever country alone, right? A lot of times families could not immigrate together as a unit, and sometimes women and children were not allowed to immigrate at all. It would just be male laborers. So a lot of families began to fragment. And a lot of the facilitators of this fragmentation were in legal documents and in legal methods. So we know a lot about the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act, but before that, in the California state, we had, according to history.state.gov, a 1850s to 1870s series of movements and measures that the California state government passed aimed at Chinese residents, ranging from requiring special licenses for Chinese businesses or workers to prevent naturalization, right? A lot of these workers could not access this documentation or were forced to go through increasingly complicated loops and increasingly complicated avenues to get to where they were trying to go, to get the correct documentation so that they could have assistance, support, legal housing, things like that. When I was bringing this up to my professor, she noted that this actually is very similar to the Native American Indian Bureau being created in the United States to, quote-unquote, deal with the Native American population in the U.S., right, which is another really tragic point in U.S. history. And this very much parallels the American South in the 1800s as well, with forced separation of families and slavery, all very similar to how these immigrants were separated from their families. There is a wonderful article by an author who is a historian. The title of the piece is Following the Paper Trail of the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act, and the author, Louie, charts the historical exclusion of Chinese immigrants in her family line from what is called the Canadian head tax in 1885, which was another piece of legislation aimed at making it more difficult for Chinese immigrants to have any form of legal documentation or status, all the way to the eventual citizenship of herself, who is the great-granddaughter of Wein, the first Chinese immigrant woman in her maternal lineage. This document is extremely moving, it's very powerful, but it discusses a lot of legal forms and privileges that were and were not afforded to each of the women in her maternal lineage. And they are invaluable as an additional source of historical evidence and context. This is a direct quote from this piece on page 2. The immense web of documents known as the CI, Chinese Immigrant Certificates, were created between 1885, when Parliament enacted the head tax, the first piece of exclusionary legislation the Canadian federal government applied to the Chinese for the first time, and 1947, when the federal government repealed the Exclusion Act. So, two notable things there. First of all, we have the head tax as a pre-Chinese Exclusion Act in the U.S. document happening in Canada, and we have the Canadian government also enacting their own form of Chinese Exclusion Act, and it's all very pattern-based. All of the countries that we see creating these kind of loops and systems that are designed to trick the immigrants into not having very many rights, not having very much representation or reputation. All of these are happening throughout, not just North America, but also Spanish colonies, right? So it all connects. From Christopher Lee's Kinship, Migration, and the Chinese Family narrative, he states in paragraph 9, from the mid-19th century, when Chinese migration to North America began en masse, to the mid-20th century, the vast majority of migrants traced their origins to several hundred villages located in the Pearl River Delta, a densely populated region located in the southern coastal province of Guangdong, between the port cities of Guangzhou and Hong Kong. Now, these immigrants came from very dense, localized areas, and a lot of them would have had a lot of history and a lot of knowledge of each other. So this all links back to this concept of fragmented family. Kinship, as the central concept defined in Christopher Lee's piece, is defined by a lot of silence and acceptance of the radical and unfair and unjust things happening in that community. And Christopher Lee goes on to talk about a story from his grandmother about his aunt who ended up having to stay silent after she was violently raped and conceived a child outside of wedlock. This concept of silence is still, and we're moving into part 3 here, but still very important and very relevant to how a lot of Chinese immigrant family lines view this concept of family. Which brings us to one of the more recent racially targeted, and I say one of because there are quite a few, but one of the more major recently targeted hate crimes or act of hate. The 1995 Manila kidnapping crisis. We're back to the Spanish colony of Manila, where there is still quite a large historically Chinese immigrant or Chinese immigrant descended population. In 1995, over $11 million in ransoms were paid to groups targeting the families of Chinese business people who they perceived as successful, as well off with money, as intelligent with money, and this caused a lot of trauma to these families. This kind of racial targeting is very, very obvious and rears its head extremely profoundly in The Downstairs Girl. And this novel is crucial to continuing to teach this history to those who have family history and those who may not be taught about this in school, so people like me. And there's quite a lot of places in this novel where this appears, so I'm going to go through a kind of front to back specific instances of these effects that I notice. And this is set in Jim Crow era Atlanta, Georgia, so quite a bit later in the timeline than some of these other pieces of legislation and history I've been talking about. One of the centralized issues in the novel is the agony that Joe feels over her lack of knowledge about her parents because she was orphaned very young and why they abandoned her. First instance of racial bias, prejudice, and this fragmentation is seen on page 28. We get the sort of feeling of a lack of Chinese women in the U.S. through Joe's knowledge that she could have her pick of, quote, fleshy-nosed bachelors, as her age and beauty would fetch hundreds and hundreds of dollars in dowry fees, which was quite a lot of money at this time. Next, we get the lack of formal documentation telling the government that Joe was born in the United States. She does not have a birth certificate and subsequently cannot become a citizen and a suffragist, which is mentioned briefly on page 61. On page 78, we come back to that idea of extremely compact immigration communities. We see old Jin, her father figure, and later we find out is her biological grandfather, the son of several notable scholar officials from the Qing dynasty, and this heritage is still extremely important in the way that old Jin is seen even in the U.S. We get another mention also there of Joe's eventual marriage and motherhood, which is championed as the most noble calling. Page 80 brings the name of the Rabbit Eyes rapist, which was a Chinese rapist who was it is alluded to in the book, the man that they caught is not actually the man who committed the crimes. We get the mention of the arrest and execution, which shows how deeply embedded the racial stereotyping and discrimination is, even in the name of trying to bring justice. Page 119 brings the discovered letter between Shang, who is Joe's biological father, who she initially believed to be an uncle, and her biological mother, who we eventually discover is Mrs. Payne. This page 119 also starts the unraveling of old Jin's deception around Zhou's parents and her heritage. But Zhou connects that Shang is in fact her father on page 189, still failing to see that Mrs. Payne is her mother until pages 273 to 278, where she gets this major revelation. Caroline is her sister, Mrs. Payne her mother, and old Jin is her grandfather. Old Jin is brutally beaten for not repaying his debts on page 289, which are also linked in with trying to protect Zhou and her family image. And page 365 brings Zhou's acknowledgement of everything that old Jin has been to her throughout her life, all of the work and the blood, sweat, and tears that he's put into providing for her and helping to, establish a good life for her. When we view these together, these instances actually show an extremely complex tangle of familial history, Chinese culture around family and the formation of family, and how interracial families were basically impossible in this period of American history. So, to wrap up, why do we care? The novels that deal with concepts like this, that deal with historically based concepts in a fictional way, that brings the reader in and makes them as interested as I was to learn more about Chinese history and Chinese immigration history, are the things that are going to keep this knowledge alive and allow young adults to be more empathetic towards others, to give them a broader worldview, to give them a broader education on history, and really connect them to their peers or their own family history in a way that otherwise they would not be exposed to. This has been a very historically heavy episode of Sound Bites. Thank you all so much for listening. Again, you can find that full works cited if you'd like to go check out any of those references that I make yourself, and I do highly recommend that you read The Downstairs Girl by Stacey Lee. Thank you all.